Welcome to NSL Unscripted, a national security law podcast, brought to you by the National Security Law Department at the U.S. Army's The Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. We bring you conversations and hot topics from NSL practitioners today, and hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome to another episode of NSL Unscripted. I am your host, Major Emily Bobenrieth, a student in the 71st graduate course at the U.S. Army's Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School, and a future professor in the National Security Department. I've spent the last year concentrating in national security law, writing on the impact of climate change on our national security, as well as focusing on the law applicable to cyberspace and information operations. I also recently had the opportunity to attend the phenomenal Cyber Operations Technical Foundations course hosted by the U.S. Army's Cyber Institute, and I met two outstanding teammates, Brandon Pugh and Major Jessica Dawson, who joined me today. From my studies and observations of the current security environment, data and data privacy seems to be all the rage. So I asked my chair, Colonel Laura West, if I could conduct research and engage with these fine experts on this topic. And it was a resounding yes from Colonel West, obviously. So Brandon and Major Dawson, thank you so much for being here today. Major Dawson is the Information Warfare Research Team Division Chief at the Army Cyber Institute at the United States Military Academy and holds a PhD from Duke University. Her research focused on the digital disruption of social processes, narrative, and privacy. Brandon is the director of the Cybersecurity and Emerging Threats Team at the R Street Institute in Washington, D.C. He also serves as a judge advocate in the U.S. Army Reserves. I want to briefly add that nothing expressed in this episode should imply any endorsement of R Street Institute, its affiliates, employees, or any of its positions. So today we're just going to have a candid discussion about how data privacy, or perhaps lack thereof, poses a risk to U.S. national security and how NSL law practitioners can better prepare for this threat. So data privacy, it may not be something that we typically think of as a national security consideration, much less classify it as a threat. So why is this assumption perhaps misguided? And Brandon, if we could just start with you.
Of course. Well, thanks for having me and to the entire National Security Department. I have to say, I love the podcast, and I'm quite jealous that you're in Charlottesville and I'm in New Jersey actually right now. So, but to your point, as a starting point, I would say data itself is important. I think it's important to remember that. For instance, it leads to innovation, new capabilities, but it also enhances current ones like artificial intelligence or AI. But it can be easily misused, and I think that's the concern. So to a starting point, we do see instances where data is either over-collected or is collected without a person even knowing. But then fast forwarding, those risks then become how it can be stolen or breached, and then how it can be misused even after it's collected. And the challenge is this can be super sensitive information, can be on super sensitive populations like children or members of our military. And it can even be combined to form profiles in individuals. And adversaries see this as a strategic resource. We've seen clear examples of how it's been used for espionage, influence campaigns, even to make traditional attacks more effective, like in the cyber arena. And I know Jess is a big fan of this, but her research touches on this, but we even see it making entire profiles on people. So I guess that's all to say that it has tremendous value, but there's also concerns and things that the military as well as the entire country need to be mindful of.
Jessica, same question for you.
Thanks again for having me. Brandon and I have worked together on a couple of papers in the past, and so we're both, clearly a lot of fun at parties when this topic comes up. So I think, this question of data as a national security risk, we've sort of tried to move towards this idea collectively as a society that data helps us make rational decisions, right? Well, this is what the data say, ergo it's right and it's unbiased, right? Well, Maria Ressa, a reporter, Rappler in the Philippines, had this really great comment. She said, data are opinions anchored in code. And just because this is what the data say, you have to actually unpack what is the data representing? So when we code someone as male or female, there's a whole lot of assumptions that go into, those two variables, a 1 or a 0. And so when we think about what the risks are from this, we already have major problems of bias in society. The data that are now being used to build these algorithms are further entrenching these biases. And so, and Wired has been doing just some absolutely phenomenal reporting over the last few years about the biases in data and algorithms. And so when we think about the risks to this, for example, right, one of the books that really opened my eyes to this problem set, and I'm going to swear, unfortunately, because it is the literal title of the book, but Chris Wiley's book, Mindfuck, and he goes into how Cambridge Analytica basically went out and bought as much data as they possibly could on individuals, things that you wouldn't think were relevant at all. And then they used it to build profiles, and they had, they got access to information on Facebook, which was really, information about you, information about your friends. So it positions you not as just an atomized individual in the data, but as a person inside of this social network, which means that the influence that they decided to run was probably a lot more effective because it looked like it came from friends and families, and it was based in content about you. And all of the political parties are doing this. So this isn't just, Cambridge Analytica worked for the Republicans. Oh gosh, the Republicans are horrible, right? Everybody's doing this. Nike is doing this. Beer companies are doing this, right? Our foreign adversaries are doing this. Scam companies are doing this. Right now, if you go to the Department of Veterans Affairs website and sign up for the burn pit registry, you will be routed to ID.me, which is a private company that is doing verification of individuals' identity. Well, first, it is the government's job to identify citizens, not a private company's, right? But now you also can go to Google, and because the Department of Veterans Affairs website has the Google Pixel on it, I can now go into Google and target anyone that has visited the Department of Veterans Affairs website with ads for what? Well, if it's to help you get more VA benefits, great. But what if it's to help, guide you towards a scam to defraud you out of your GI Bill? What if it's to guide you towards, one of these multi-level marketing schemes that, heavily target military spouses, right? So the fact that the Google Pixel is on the Department of Veterans Affairs website enables advertising and targeting towards veterans and towards military personnel. So as we think about just a very benign, case like that, what else can be done with that? What else can we target people with? Justin Sherman at Duke has done some really, really great research showing, right, there's some reporting that he's done showing that there have been data brokers that have built lists of people that have cognitive decline, right, that are dealing with dementia or Alzheimer's or something like that. And they are on a suckers list that is then sold to people to target them with more, advertisements meant to defraud them. That's horrible, right? And when we think about, what are ways that you lose your security clearance? Too much debt, infidelity, all of these things can cause you to lose your security clearance. Well, if I can now sucker you into a high risk loan, guess what? You're now a security risk.
So what I'm hearing is a few things, right? First, I'm hearing sort of, I see data as almost a little bit like death by a thousand cuts, in the sense that there's bits and pieces of me out there, but they're being gathered and creating, I think, Brandon, you said a profile or like a map maybe of who I am. And what's even scarier is that it's happening in ways I may not be aware, or possibly I signed a disclaimer that, none of us read. So I've agreed to this, but have I really? Because I have no idea the extent, right, at which this is being seeped through to different organizations. And so if we just take a very simple example, if I record myself on YouTube and post it on my account, what are the different ways in which it can go? How could it have potential for national security implications? I mean, something that would seem so innocuous, how is it not?
Mary Ebling has this wonderful book called The Afterlives of Data. And she talks about these data selves, these representations of us in the data. And so it is really, it's not just the YouTube video in isolation. If you use Google services, Gmail, Chrome, et cetera, right? They're scooping up everything about you that they can, and they're dumping it into a profile about you. You can actually go in and see what Google has on for like what categories do they have you in for marketing, right? You can actually see that, but you have to have marketing turned on in order to see that. So because I have mine turned off, I can't actually see where they have me, which is interesting, right? Like they have data on me, but unless I click to turn this button on, I can't see what it is. The other thing that Ebling talks about in her book that was just, I'm pretty jaded about this area, but I was even more horrified, is that your medical information is only covered and protected by HIPAA if it is in a covered entity, right? So like if it is in a hospital system, it is protected data. The minute it leaves that hospital system and goes out to, say, an app, it is no longer protected. So the credit bureaus, right? And Google and Facebook and Amazon all probably have medical data on you, as well as all of your search history, all of your, purchasing history, et cetera, et cetera. So when we start to think about the completeness of the pictures about us, and we don't have any idea what's in them, we don't have any idea if it's accurate, it gets really, really scary really, really quickly. There is nothing that you can do on the internet that is quote unquote not innocuous. It's not gonna it's all, you should assume it's going to be aggregated somewhere, and it's going to be used against you. Shoshana Zuboff talks about consent washing. Oh, you signed the terms and conditions. Yeah, and you have no rights to object. Again, eBlink talks about you don't have the right to opt out of hospitals doing whatever they want with your data. You are notified of their privacy practices. You are not given the option to consent. Think about that for a second. Some of your most personal private data, you have no say-so over what a hospital does with it.
Jess brought up a great point on HIPAA. It's actually really timely because just recently, Congress actually held a hearing looking at what we call sectoral privacy law, like HIPAA or the GLBA, which covers the finance sector, looks at what they actually cover, because we don't have actually a comprehensive privacy law in the United States, much like other countries, including China. Whether they follow it, that's a different story, but they actually have one on paper. But the GDPR in Europe, we don't have an equivalent in the US. So all we have in the US, and I'll elaborate on this later, is these sectoral laws just covering specific sectors, or this growing trend of state laws. And matter of fact, just recently, we've just had our 7th state pass a state law. Outside of that, there's no guarantee for privacy or protection in the U.S., with a very few exceptions, which is concerning.
Very concerning. I want to shift a little bit now to current events, looking to Russia, Ukraine. How have we seen exploitation of this type of data in that specific conflict? Brandon, we can start with you if you'd like.
Of course. Yeah. Unfortunate reality is we have seen this come front and center in Russia. Many people had suspected or known it was possible in the past, but this was one of the earliest publicly accounted times in a military setting. We saw Russia, or at least those affiliated or supporting Russia like that. And as NSL practitioners, we know that's not always clear, but they were collecting information on specific populations, like members of the Ukrainian military, to either target them for physical violence or at the very least for disinformation purposes, like sending messages through various texts saying, give up, lay down your arms, or to spread information on successes that were actually proven later to be false. And how do they do this? Some were done through sophisticated means using malware and other cyber measures, but largely it was done with information that's publicly out there. To Jess's point earlier, a lot of this information just is already available. You can either amass it yourself, or you could just buy it from a data broker, or as some call third-party collecting entities, to call them by their technical name. And the unfortunate reality is this is not limited to Russia. That presents a clear example. But take another one like China. They have a campaign right now to collect as much information they can on their own citizens, on our allies, on American military, and on Americans overall. And that's a major issue. And social media is just one avenue for it. Really, anybody that collects data or is amassing it somehow is a source for our adversaries to collect it and use it against us.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we've seen a lot of examples in the Ukraine conflict. Ukraine was sending messages home to people's parents. They were sending pictures of their children to people's parents who had been killed, trying to, inform Russians of what was actually going on in the war. That's just the start, right? When we look at, if you go back and you look at, the situations where we had in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we had mass casualty events, for example. One event in particular, so Sadr City in 2004, the battalion stayed in blackout comms. So when someone's killed in action, the unit goes into what's called blackout to prevent anyone from notifying the family before official means, right? Like that is the goal, is we want to make sure that we inform families appropriately. The unit stayed in blackout comms for like 10 days because they couldn't find one of the parents. Let's fast forward that to a social media era now, when everyone has their phones and we have a mass casualty event. And now you add in the deepfake technology because soldiers are on TikTok and everywhere else. And you think our adversaries aren't gathering up that information. They are. Think about the power of having a prisoner of war saying that they denounce the country, et cetera. Think about the power of, and it doesn't have to be real. It can absolutely be a deep fake, right? Or a cheap fake or what have you, right? Think back to Mogadishu with airmen being, our pilots being dragged through the streets. Right? That was very powerful. And that was before the age of social media. Think about what that would look like now. So the ability to target, the ability to influence, it's only going to get worse. and our systems are not set up to deal with it right now in any way, shape, or form. We're constantly playing, catch up. And I think it's a really dangerous situation that we're in a lot of ways, because we're not prepared for, the chaos machine to go into full effect, the next time we go into conflict.
And so the whole mentality of that's them, this is us, really doesn't apply here. What is happening in Russia, Ukraine, maybe not to the extent of what's happening in China, Brandon, what you said, just in terms of the way that their government is structured and the way that they do business. But it certainly is something that, just what I'm hearing you say, that we are facing, we are going to face, and that we are just unprepared to do.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to the China example, think about who's done the 23andMe or the different genetic testing. There are very compelling reasons for people to want to do that. Those are private companies, and those companies can either sell your data or be hacked and have it stolen. There was an article a couple of months, years, I don't know, time has lost all meaning, about prenatal tests, genetic tests that were the data was being sent back to China. That's on major, like millions and millions of women, and prenatal tests went back to China with the genetic data. They've collected massive amounts of genetic data from their Uyghur population, right? So the surveillance and tied to, you can change, you can change your hair, you can change your name, but you can't change your genetics, at least as far as we know. So the ability to move through the world and not be surveilled is getting much narrower, right? It's not a thing. And, it's fine until you become the character of the day, right? And the minute you become, the main character, then everything you've ever done is open for the whole world. That's not a fun place to be, and it can be very dangerous.
Brandon, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, maybe just a few things. I think to really underscore the point, this is not an isolated capability. We see this at Russia, Ukraine, but it's happening now in the US. Maybe it's not getting as much media attention because we're not currently in conflict. But the fact of the matter is, the US is unfortunately going to be in a future conflict one day. And I think this is going to be more prevalent then. And technology, as we know it, is just expanding so rapidly. The challenges and capabilities we see today are going to be even farther ahead tomorrow. Like, take artificial intelligence as example. Been around for a while, obviously, but it's just recently become a household name. And the number of people using it on a daily basis is skyrocketed. So I really think it's important to think of like, what is being done now? What can we do? I mentioned earlier efforts by Congress. I am thrilled to see Congress really hone in on this issue. Progress is a little slower than I think some would hope, but just for context, last Congress, the 117th Congress, passed the American Data Privacy and Protection Act out of committee. It would do a lot, but it would really put Americans on notice and empower them to have rights on how their data is collected and used. And that would benefit all Americans, just not members of the military. But I think those in really sensitive populations would most benefit. And I'm also thrilled to see that this is moving beyond just a traditional consumer privacy issue. That's really important. But just recently, coming from the White House, we see data privacy and security get shout outs in the National Cybersecurity Strategy, as well as the annual threat assessment of the intelligence community. So it's really nice to see these issues become more mainstream. And I think 2 or 3 takeaways from those 2 reports, to Jess's point, they flag the health and genetic info being collected by adversaries as a key issue. We also saw the White House affirmatively call for action on the use, transfer, and security of personal information, which is good to see that. And third, really drawing attention to the prevalence of new technology and how they're really expanding quicker than we can keep up with and create norms around privacy and security.
Yeah, and to sort of ride this small positivity wave, if you will. So data isn't necessarily all bad. We're seeing these moves in the legislature and coming out of the executive in terms of how to protect Americans, but also the Army wants to use data to make our capabilities stronger, more robust. So in fact, Secretary of the Army has defined 6 objectives to help guide the force to prepare for future competition and conflict. And the second of those objectives aims to ensure that the Army will be more data-centric, that we will use more data in order to make us a more efficient and effective force. So my question is, how is the data privacy threat, which is real, how is that distinct from using that data in a more positive way and becoming more data-centric?
It's always good to query, how can we use data? Like, what is the data? What data do we have and what can it tell us? But the thing that we're missing in this conversation about data-centric is asking the question of why do we have what data that we have? And there's this wonderful book, Invisible Women, Data Bias in a World Designed for Men, by Carolyn Caridad-Perez. And she basically lays out all of the ways that data is collected and designed based on the male default, right? And not to get all pinko commie feminist, but this idea that, the male default is the standard and everything else is a deviation from it has serious consequences. And just to use one example that's I think it's relatively well known, but maybe not. Male heart attack symptoms are, that elephant sitting on your chest, the pain in your left arm. Well, they've said for years, women don't seem to have the same heart attack risk. Well, it turns out that women's heart attack symptoms look nothing like male heart attack symptoms. So we're training doctors to look for X. We're not training doctors to look for Y, ergo Y isn't in the data. So we have to acknowledge that there's a lot of data and a lot of it is very biased, not by purpose or design or like, the evil men are trying to exclude the women, but like this idea that like the default assumptions are not necessarily asking the right questions. So I think going to, more data centric is not necessarily a bad thing, but we have to query what data do we have and what is missing in the data that we have. And we have to be deliberate about asking those questions if we want to ensure that the data is going to show us the right answers.
No, I think that's a great point, Jess. Brandon, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so to your question, I think they're distinct, but definitely related. Let me first say I agree that data needs to be a key priority for the military. I was thrilled to see the secretary put that out, as well as leadership fleshing out afterwards in terms of what that actually means in practice. And there was more to this, but essentially they got at two threads. Empowering leaders with the right info at the right time, as well as equally as important, leveraging analytics to understand, actually assess the data. Because just having the data, arguably still important, but if you're not actually using it to its fullest ability, it's not as effective in a military setting. But I think it's important to keep in mind the data's privacy and security risks that come with having that data. And there's a real opportunity for America, as well as our military, to take a leadership role here. That way we're setting the norms. And right or wrong, so many countries, especially our allied nations, look to the US. So I think it's important for us to have a vision for privacy and security of data and how it can be effectively used, and for us to lead in that space. And then any data we do collect, as well as data that's collected on Americans, we need to make sure is actually safeguarded and that we embrace privacy around it. That way we can have kind of two scenarios. We want a scenario where data is used and is embraced and develop new technologies, but equally as important on the other side, we do need to safeguard it and value privacy.
To build on that just a little bit more, right? Military kids go to the doctor because they have insurance. And one of the biggest things that we're seeing as we've transitioned to MHS Genesis is a slowdown of the accessions process because military kids have medical profile in terms of the packet of information on them. So like, yay, the kids have gotten to go to the doctor and gotten medical care. That's awesome. But now how much of it is serving as a barrier to entry because you can see their history and their past? That's one of the things that Chris Wiley talks about is if we tie our future selves to our past selves, we can never move on. We will always be changed to who we were. And I think that is a really critical piece as we think about specifically about medical data and about, military kids, for example, right? They're in the system and we can now see everything about them for better or for worse. And that may mean, part of our challenges with recruiting now are that military kids are being excluded because they have medical data on them. And I don't have any evidence for that. And there's been a little bit of reporting on that. It's logical to assume that part of the challenges with recruiting are because of the medical standards, which, oh, by the way, haven't been revisited in decades.
And when you said military kids, the other thing that comes to my mind are a lot of who our population is who are serving are young soldiers, right? They're young kids, if you will, late teens, early 20s. And that generation of soldiers, they have a prolific social media footprint. We are facing a generation of soldiers who have a strong and open social media presence. And so to bring it from the treetops, which is where we've been, to just a more practical sense, I wanted to close with your thoughts, both of your thoughts on how NSL practitioners, what role do we play in addressing the threat now? And how can we help the commands that we advise address the threat, especially with the challenge that the majority of their formation is putting out content every single day that may have mission and operational impacts. Jess, we can start with you.
Look, I don't think there's a person that's over the age of 40 that says, wow, I really wish social media had existed when I was a kid. I'm pretty sure it's a universal consensus that we are all glad that this stuff did not exist when we were kids, because kids do stupid things. That's part of growing. It's part of learning. It's part of, figuring out who you want to become. That's a yay, these kids are all connected to each other. And I think it's wonderful that, the internet has given the nerdy kids, an ability to find other kids that are into Dungeons and Dragons. Those things are wonderful, but it's also a huge risk for these kids as well, because you go through a stupid phase and you have opinions that have changed, and the internet is forever. So I think it's a huge risk. The other thing, just to, put an extra pin in the privacy issues, is Google Classroom. Google Classroom is collecting data on all of our children without any consent from the parents, without any restrictions on what can be done with that data, where is it going, and what are they doing with it? We don't know. So as we think about all of that, right? Yay, good, computers in class, makes life easier for teachers, awesome. Okay, what are the second and third order effects of it? What data is collected on all of our kids, and how is that going to be used against them in the future? Because this data is almost never used for individual benefits. It's always used for companies to exploit and make money, and for commercial, for profit. If the data was being used to help people, I don't think anybody would be complaining about this in large ways, right? The threat to individuals, the threats to our children to be tied to whoever they were. Like, if you do something stupid at 18, yes, there should be consequences. Should it be the rest of your life? I think we have to have a really, really long and hard conversation as a society about what is the blast radius of a tweet, because people have lost their lives and careers because of, one or two, stupid things online. And I think that's a huge issue.
Jess, do you think training may help that? I mean, in order to help this younger generation understand the ripple effect of what they do?
Well, the minute it becomes personal for someone, we had a situation again, time has lost all meaning. This TikTok influencer, made some Nazi jokes, and he was an Army lieutenant. And thank you for serving. He's now no longer in the Army. Those are not good things to do. He became an object lesson in play stupid games, win stupid prizes. I'm okay with that, right? I'm okay with him losing his career for that. We can do some training, right? But the goal is, we have to think about how to institutionally respond to this stuff. And realistically, we do need to start training everyone, not just the younger generation, but across the board of, things that get posted online do get used against you. It's a big problem. Training is just one piece of it. And I think we've got a big, we have a societal shift on our hands. We have to figure out how to both embrace it and rein in some of the problems.
Brandon, your thoughts?
Yeah, just quickly follow up on a point Jess made, then share some thoughts to your question. I would say, just to underscore, maybe I try to convey this in my testimony in Congress in I guess February. It's hard to keep track of time, but I just want to underscore that here too, is that a lot of these privacy and security threats around data that we've mentioned are not isolated to just like big tech companies. I know a lot of times they're getting the attention because everybody really seems, right or wrong, has some issue with big tech for different reasons. But I would say we've seen companies of all sizes be violators and concerns here. Matter of fact, some of our smallest data brokers are actually only a handful of companies, yet they collect and harvest information on millions and millions of Americans that is super sensitive. So like I always try to tell people, like, when we're thinking of a solution here, whether it's legislation, regulation, or just good action by like the federal government, we need to make sure we're addressing it all size companies. But to your point directly, I think this whole conversation really brings me back to why I think national security law is one of the coolest areas to practice in the military, if not the coolest, because there's a massive opportunity to truly be a counselor and an advisor to a commander in decision making here, because there's not clear answers always. And as this technology and space evolves, it even becomes more difficult. And there's an opportunity to apply policy knowledge here, because we've talked about policy and action by legislatures and by other branches outside of DoD. That may seem irrelevant, but cyber and national security law has such a huge policy nexus and implications with other federal agencies. And that's really key as a practitioner to keep that in mind. You may not be the one directly advising or interacting with the Department of State, but it's some chain and some person in your chain of command is. So that's important to keep in mind. So I would say the big issue, though, is tech is only going to expand, and so is data usage. So I think it's important to personally be aware and take proactive steps. So having conversations like these to bring these issues to light is really important, because I think the average person, they understand their data is out there that could be misused, but making it tangible and providing concrete examples is not often done. And as a practitioner, it's super important to stay up to date on policy measures being put out by DoD and then individual services. Like, for instance, when there's a TikTok ban, making sure that your commander is aware of that and is truly implemented in the formation is key. And TikTok gets a lot of attention, but That's just, I think, the latest concern. Those concerns are only going to come up. So I think it's really important to stay on top of the policy landscape so you can advise a commander.
Well, with that, Brandon, Jessica, I think it's about time to wrap up. Any final comments from either of you before we end today's session?
So I think Brandon hit the nail on the head that this requires policy. We can educate individuals, but I'm someone that cares about this and I can't opt out of everything. I don't know where all my data is. We like to say we need to educate people, but realistically, this requires systemic intervention. This requires policy protections at the national level because it is too big for any one person to really opt out of. And I think, one of the things that I would love to see is for a requirement for any product to be able to be operated without an app and without a Wi-Fi connection. So if I want to, have a security camera on my home, I need to be able to operate it on a standalone basis that I can still use it without the information being out there on the internet. Because so much of these devices are coming now with built-in subscriptions and connections. So we need systemic solutions to this, not individual effort. It's not sufficient to focus on individuals, I think.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think on taking a broader solution. I think that's important for key leaders in the Department of Defense to be mindful of as well. Like, yes, there is a role for the executive branch, or that being the White House, I should say, in Congress, but there is an immediate and next steps that DoD can take to keep individual soldiers and members of the military safe, but then also more structural measures that can be taken internally without broader, maybe not as ideal of a solution, but it's probably arguably better than none. So just that, I think that's my final point. I always happy a resource in these matters, and not to shamelessly promote some of our past work, but Jess and I did I guess it was a Defense News article maybe last year or so. So I think that kind of expands upon some of these, especially Ukraine interests, if people are interested in that.
Thank you both so much for lending your time and expertise in this area. That is all the time we have for today. So for our listeners, stay tuned for more episodes for NSL Unscripted from the National Security Law Department at TJAGSLIS. Out.
This episode of NSL Unscripted was brought to you by the National Security Law Department at the U.S. Army's the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. The views presented are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Defense or its components, the Department of the Army, or the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. Our department also produces the Operational Law Handbook, accessible online. We hope you have enjoyed this episode and look forward to future episodes for NSL practitioners. Thank you.